It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. If you live in Metro Detroit, the last week probably tested your patience and maybe your refrigerator. First, the heat. As temperatures pushed past 100, the grid strained, and a substation in Warren failed. Thousands lost power, some for many hours. Then, just as that passed, the storms came. Friday night, winds tore through the region and dropped 80-foot trees onto power lines. And at the peak, hundreds of thousands of homes went dark. Some homes are still dark this morning, days later. And here's the thing. That's the grid we already have, straining under an ordinary Michigan summer. Now Michigan is preparing to add something extraordinary. Data centers built to power artificial intelligence, each one hungry for as much electricity as a small city. And the decisions about who pays for that and how are being made right now, mostly out of public view. My guest thinks a lot about who answers to the public when big energy decisions get made. Nicholas Schreck is the dean of the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. Nick, welcome back to the Metro.
Great to be with you, Robin. Thank you.
So let's start with the week we just had. 2 rounds of outages, one from heat, one from storms. Were those a sign the grid is failing, or is that just what summer does to an aging system?
Well, it's a little bit of both, really. We have, as you mentioned, an aging grid that is under strain, and we have more intense storms with higher winds, larger amounts of lightning that we're seeing, again, because of a warming climate with more energy in the atmosphere. That means these storms are going to continue to get more intense. So yes, it is normal that in Michigan we have thunderstorms in the summertime, right? Those of us that have lived here our lives, I know that that's part of the annual cycle, but these storms are getting more intense. We're getting higher gusts of straight line winds that can be very difficult for the trees to withstand them, so the limbs break off and hit the power lines and cause outages. So while it's normal, it's sort of like normal on steroids, because you have this superheated atmosphere that's causing, again, stronger wind gusts, more intense storms.
Okay, so what you're talking about essentially is that we are going to continue to feel the effects of climate change, and these intensifying storms are symptomatic of that. And then on top of that, we have to grasp here the size of something else that's coming. That one data center that's being built near Ann Arbor in Saline Township is going to use about as much electricity as a small city, enough on its own to raise DTE's entire load by a meaningful chunk. And this is not a one-off. There are more of these in the pipeline.
Right.
So for a grid that just showed us twice in 1 week where its limits are, what does it actually mean to pile that kind of new demand on top?
Well, there's a couple different dynamics here. One is how you generate electricity and the amount of electricity that we need for just sort of like our baseline operations, right? To make sure that we have enough electricity to power our homes, to power businesses and, manufacturing and all of that. So you need to make sure you have enough power available when people need to use it. So that takes a lot of planning, a lot of strategy that, folks that manage the electric grid spend a lot of time trying to project what our energy use will be today and into the future, because it's not as simple. If you need to add let's say 100,000 homes or a large data center to the grid, you need to be able to generate enough electricity to cover that need. And it's not as simple as flipping on a light switch to add more electrical generating capacity. It takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of work. These are major infrastructure projects. And the way that we generate electricity in Michigan, it has changed over the last 30 years or so, meaning that we do have a more diversified electrical generating capacity in the state, but we still rely primarily on natural gas. So we burn natural gas to spin turbines to generate electricity. We also still burn coal in Michigan to generate electricity. We have nuclear reactors that generate electricity. And then we also have wind and solar. So if you're adding a new data center or you're adding any large use, like let's say we have multiple big auto manufacturing facilities that decide to open up in Southeast Michigan, they're going to need power. And so that means you have to figure out how to generate it. Now, this is, again, not something that you do overnight. A lot of planning goes into this, a lot of money. And so you're seeing now nationally with this rise in data centers coming online and projections for vastly more to come online, you're seeing this need for additional electric generating capacity. And then the question is, how do you do that? Do you generate it through renewable sources, which would be certainly my preference to lessen the climate impacts from generating electricity? Or do you burn more natural gas? Do you burn more coal? And I'll just pause here and say, many of the data centers that are online today in all around the country are being powered by there are these generators running on gas. So they're either diesel or natural gas generators that are powering these data centers, and they're creating significant air quality concerns in communities next to these data centers. So when you hear things like, "Oh, we're going to bring a new data center in, it's going to be run on renewable energy," that's maybe in the future that could be true, but in the short term, they're typically running these on these sort of like standby generators that are run on diesel or natural gas. So I know that's a lot there, but that's kind of how we have to think about where we get our power, and do we have enough?
Okay, well, I want to break apart something you just said there that's quite interesting, Nick, and that is the capacity that Michigan has right now in terms of its energy. And so you're saying we're not using a ton of wind and solar right now. And it has me wondering if some of the states where there is a much greater capacity for wind and solar, if it would make more sense to have some of these data centers located there where they could be powered by that wind and solar, as opposed to in Michigan and other places where they are running off of electricity or gas.
Well, that would certainly be better from a climate perspective because we would be burning less fossil fuels and contributing less carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere and other harmful emissions as well. So, I mean, I think now the issue, okay, with electricity, and this is going to get a little bit wonky here, so I apologize, but if you generate electricity in one location, you then have to get that power to where it needs to be used. Okay, so that's why we have power lines, right? So back to our conversation about electrical power outages. A lot of our electricity in Southeast Michigan comes from the Detroit Edison Fermi plant down in Monroe, the nuclear reactor, also from the Monroe coal-fired power plant. And there's these massive utility lines that run from those facilities all the way up to Detroit, and then they go on, and further afield. And so you have to get that power. So, like let's say where you've got a lot of wind capacity in Nebraska. If we're generating electricity there, maybe you can locate data centers there and they can get the power to them without having to have these massive transmission lines to get the power elsewhere. But that's often a challenge, is that where it's windiest and sunniest in our country, that's not always the closest to our major population centers. So if you generate the power there, you still have to get it to where it needs to be used. And in transmission of power, you actually lose power. Okay, so like as the electricity is traveling along the wires, you lose some, and so it's just a lot. Again, has to go into planning. So even if you're generating, in other words, we don't use 100% of the power we generate because you lose some of it in transmission. All right, and so you have to just be really kind of smart about where you locate these things. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense. You could have data centers in areas close to renewable energy sources, including things like hydroelectric. If you have existing dams that are generating electricity through turbines, there's some smarter places to put these things. The issue is they're popping up all over. There's such a demand. We're being told there's a demand. I mean, this is the other thing. A lot of this is very opaque and difficult from the public's perspective to understand, how much data center capacity is really needed for the current demand in the marketplace. A lot of it seems to be that they're building this stuff out in anticipation of there being this future demand for all of these technologies. I would say, I think a little bit of prevention, a little bit of foresight would be welcome here so that we don't build a bunch of, whether it's electric generating capacity, like new natural gas plants or a new nuclear reactor, if we don't need them, because those cost a lot of money. And coming back to how we started the program, we all, at least in a Detroit Edison service area, we're paying for that electric generation through our rates.
That's exactly what I want to think about is our electricity rates potentially going up and the fact that we're not clear on how many people actually want to see these data centers popping up. But so far from from reporting that is happening all over this country and from town halls, what we're seeing is a lot of contempt, a lot of opposition for these data centers. I do want to think about the other side of this, though. I mean, Citizens Research Council's Eric Paul Dennis told the Metro that electricity rates shouldn't necessarily go up because of data centers. Here he is.
You cannot discount the idea that data centers can increase electricity rates, but it's actually not that common and quite minimal. Regulatory agencies have now kind of gotten ahead of this, and I don't think it's going to be much of a concern for the future.
That's a strong statement. Regulatory agencies have gotten ahead of this. What do you make of that perspective?
Well, so here in Michigan, that would be our Public Service Commission primarily, that they have oversight over new electric generating capacity, also large infrastructure projects that use a lot of electricity, like a data center. There's definitely some truth to that statement in that, if you're looking to use a certain amount of power at a facility and you plan to generate that power, and you can account like basically what this facility is going to need, and then they can pay for either new or existing electrical generating capacity they can pay for and not have that be spread amongst all of us, as ratepayers. That's all fine and good. I mean, I think, but you have to be very, very careful about how these agreements are structured. You have to be very careful about monitoring and making sure that you don't sort of see that spill over and creep into just general households that are having to kind of help support some of this infrastructure deployment. And the other thing I'll say about Detroit Edison and many other utilities around the country is that they have this sort of like public-private in that they do have, they're investor owned, they trade on the stock exchange. And so they're always looking to return money to their shareholders, meaning, Detroit Edison. So, Robin, you or I, we can buy shares in DTE stock. And then, what they're trying to do is make sure that they're returning profits to those shareholders. And they often do that through infrastructure projects, where they finance those, they sell bonds, and they get a return on that investment. Now that is separate from ratepayer dollars, but I think it's very difficult to separate the two in terms of the certainly the public perception, where you've got these companies that are on one hand providing a public service, public benefit, electricity to our homes that we all pay for as ratepayers, and they also have a motivation to return profits to their shareholders. And that's where these data centers are getting really in the mix with communications on sort of that profit corporate side of utilities, rather than on the grid and electrical distribution side of their business.
Well, you're reflecting the complaints that I've heard from multiple people, which is that utilities, some say, should not be profit driven. If this was a nonprofit entity, how could that change things for us?
Well, typically, publicly owned utilities, there is a greater amount of oversight. You may have publicly elected people that sit on the utility board. Just more opportunities for public involvement in their decision-making process. I don't necessarily think, and this might be a little controversial to some of my environmental friends to say this, but I don't necessarily think it's the worst structure in the world to have a company that can be funded by capital from investors to do large infrastructure projects. I think the question is, how responsive is that company being to the needs of their public and to keeping the rates low? And what we've seen is a bit of a disconnect here in our service area in Detroit Edison, where rates are increasing. There's a lot of problems with reliability, a lot of problems with getting power restored after things like major storms like we've had, and yet the company continues to be very profitable. And so that's where I think it's just, if you have a public utility model, there is by nature more public oversight, more public involvement. Whereas, DTE's board, that's a corporate board that's, sort of appointed and runs their own processes. And, you and I as ratepayers are really sort of shut out of that project, that whole analysis unless we're also shareholders.
Hey, Nick, I mean, the joke that I've heard is the only way to save some money with DTE as a ratepayer is to buy some stock in it. But I do want to acknowledge what DTE is saying right now. I mean, they told us that their contract requires the data center company to cover the cost of new infrastructure, that the deals will pour nearly $9 billion into the electric system, and that DTE actually intends to pause new rate requests for at least 2 years as the centers come online. What do you make of that promise?
Hey, let's get that in writing. Let's make that binding. I'd really like to have them be held to that type of statement. And this isn't anything in particular about DTE, but we often see large companies, corporations make promises about what they're going to do in the future, and there's very little accountability often if they don't do what they say they were going to do. So I think having some sort of a binding agreement, maybe that's something that again can go through the Public Service Commission. I'm not familiar with what discussions they may be having with the regulator as part of rolling out new data centers. And I'll just pause for a second, Robin, and say that might all be well and good. That if there's a business demand for data centers, there's a utility that says they have the ability to meet that demand, and that they say they can do that without harming their ratepayers or increasing electricity rates. Okay, that's great. That sounds fine. But my other question would be, is this what we should be doing? Should we be investing all of this money, all of these resources to generate electricity for facilities that we may in fact not even need, there might not be demand for, and that are just going to be gobbling up so much energy that could be put to better uses? I would prefer that we not generate it at all, because then we're saving resources and we're not continuing to deplete, whether it's fossil fuels or to deplete other resources that go into generating electricity.
Well, it's not only a question that some have of whether we should be doing this, Nick, but I realize another question folks have is how it is happening. So when DTE struck its deal to power the data center in Saline Township, the Michigan Public Service Commission approved the contracts without holding a contested case hearing. The kind of open proceeding where the Attorney General and consumer advocates could examine the deal. So then in April, Attorney General Dana Nessel took the commission to court. She's appealing what she calls its approval of, quote, secret data center contracts. She says they were redacted heavily. Now, DTE pushes back hard on that. It told us only commercially sensitive terms were redacted, that the pricing and rate details are public in its filings, and that the Oracle contract with the data center has some of the, quote, strongest customer protections in the country. Nick, who's right here? Is this genuinely secret, or is Nessel overstating it?
I'll be honest here. I do not know enough of the specifics. I haven't been involved in that litigation. I haven't read the pleadings, and so I can't really give you, my sort of score on, if I'm calling balls and strikes here about, who's right, who's wrong. I will say this: the Attorney General has a clear role to play in ensuring that the public is protected through Public Service Commission proceedings. And so it is fully within that office's purview to be questioning this process, to be absolutely clear that the public is protected and that our interests are considered as part of that process. So, some of this could, of course, be statements that are made a little bit, perhaps with language that's a little bit more forceful than what we might actually see a judgment, coming out of a court case. Some of that might be a little bit for some public relations type of purposes, but again, it is fully within the statutory authority of the Attorney General to take up this charge on behalf of the people of the state of Michigan, and it's fully within DTE's rights to push back and say, no, this is what we're all doing. And the final thing I'll say is that we do have a long tradition in this country and under our laws that business negotiations going on between two parties, they can often happen in private, because you wouldn't want, speculation to come in, prices to jump up. Like if, somebody gets wind of a new development coming into a part of Detroit, folks might try and buy up properties and hold them to run the prices up, that kind of thing. So there's sometimes secrecy is appropriate and it is completely legal, even though it may at first appear unsavory, from an outsider's perspective. And again, I don't know enough about the specifics of this particular case to give you, my opinion, sort of one way or the other. I'm just sort of saying that like this is kind of a normal part of this process where you would have an attorney general, again, doing what she should be doing, which is making sure that the laws are followed and that the public is protected as part of this process. And again, there may be some secrecy that is sort of warranted because of the nature of large capital investment projects and making sure that the parties can negotiate in good faith. Beyond that, we'll have to wait and see. Get the evidence in front of the court and see what happens.
Okay, well, that's understandable. You can't go too deep into a case like this without really having been part of it or studying it yourself. But here's a question for you that I'm guessing you have some thoughts on. I mean, you have thoughts on everything that we talk about, Nick, but something I think maybe you could go a little bit deeper on. There's a question about the body making all these calls in the first place. And I'm talking about the commission that approved this, the Public Service Commission. Yeah. It's just 3 people, all appointed by the governor. Last year, Governor Whitmer declined to reappoint the commissioner that ratepayer and clean energy groups considered their strongest voice on the panel. And the governor replaced her with a former aide. Now, those same critics point out that Governor Whitmer is the elected official who's taken the most indirect contributions from DTE over her career. It's about $1 million. Now, the governor never explained the decision, and she's got a strong clean energy record of her own, which I would be remiss not to point out. But when you look at who sits on that commission as it weighs these data centers, does the makeup of it give you any pause?
It does. It does give some pause, and I'll just say that this is always an issue with money in politics. With as you just said, I mean, so even if everything is fully above board and there's no quid pro quo going on here, the appearance of a governor who is over her career taken a lot of money, a lot of political donations from a utility that then has very significant business in front of a board where she, depending on their terms, and the terms have different numbers of years, so there's often a holdover from one governor to another before they can appoint a new member of the Public Service Commission. And they're supposed to be like, one Dem, one Republican, one Independent. That's kind of the way that it's structured. So when it was set up, there was some, thought into making this be a little bit less political, a little bit less partisan. But there's that concern. So, I mean, look, are we going to get money out of politics today? No. I mean, there's been proposals, ballot initiatives to try and restrict the amount of money that utilities can put into our elections. And I personally think that would be good because you again eliminate some of these appearances or, perhaps actuality where like, again, I don't want to make any accusations about whether there's actually undue influence from these political donations, but having a governor appoint members of a Public Service Commission where that governor also then takes significant political contributions from entities that are in front of that commission, it's concerning. It'll always be concerning regardless of who is the governor. I think this comes up over and over again because Detroit Edison, Consumers Energy, they're always giving political donations to try and get their views, their agenda, through the legislature. And so, yeah, I think it's problematic. I really, if we could make it so that groups that are having significant business in front of the Public Service Commission are not able to donate to political campaigns for people that will be making decisions about either the composition of the Public Service Commission or also the legislature. Because remember, the legislature, they can also pass laws that dictate how the Public Service Commission operates. To that point, just a few years ago, we had legislation that changed major infrastructure projects now can be handled by the Public Service Commission with less input from local communities. For again, and the reason was like, okay, you had things like wind farms or solar farms that were being blocked by opposition from a local community, like let's say a small township that didn't want the solar farm, even though you had the landowner that wanted to do it and had the contracts in place. So there was thinking like, okay, we need some more like planning on a regional level or statewide level for these major infrastructure projects. And I remember thinking like, okay, that seems like a good idea. It seems like it makes sense. now you sort of flip that around. It's like, okay, you've got data centers and okay, major infrastructure project, uses a lot of energy. Public Service Commission is sort of taking this main role in approving them with a little bit less influence from the local government. And here we are. So I'll just say that the legislature, again, they could revisit that. They can revisit the regulatory scope, the processes that the Public Service Commission follows. So it's, coming up on primary season, election season. When people are talking to candidates for office, for state house, state senate, ask them what they think about data centers. Ask them what they think about the Public Service Commission. See if their views are in line with yours as a voter, and if not, you can choose whether or not to support them, because that's, again, the legislature, they can dictate the purview of the Public Service Commission. And so that's an important thing to remember. So while, yes, it's, the commissioners are appointed by the governor, they have that authority currently, that authority can always change based on legislation.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. My guest is Nick Schreck, Dean of the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. We've been talking about the data centers coming to Michigan and whether the rest of us end up paying for the power those data centers need. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, the fight over how to keep the lights on and the one thing that might give you personally a little more control over your own bill. Stay with us. It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. If you're just joining us after a week that knocked out power to hundreds of thousands of people across Metro Detroit, we're looking at what happens as Michigan adds data centers that each use as much electricity as a small city, and who decides who pays for it. My guest is Nick Schreck, Dean of Detroit Mercy's Law School. Nick, I want to offer a different angle on all this, one that I know you're familiar with. And it's the question of individual control. So over in Europe, and especially in Germany, more than 1 million households have started putting small plug-in solar panels on their balconies. Now, to be clear about what these do and they don't do, they're not going to keep your lights on during a blackout. They actually shut off when the grid goes down. But they lower how much power you're pulling from the grid day to day, and they bring your own bill down. Some states here, Utah and Maine, I'm thinking specifically, have passed laws making them legal. Michigan has not. What's actually stopping it here?
Well, there is some regulatory concern about, if you add thousands of these, individual solar panels, at people's homes, if you add that connected to the grid, utilities raise safety concerns, that you need to make sure that there's certain protections in place to prevent things like electrical shock or unwanted harm to the grid from all of these different solar panels. I mean, the good news is they figured out how to do this in other places, as you mentioned. I mean, in Germany, it's happening at a pretty amazing. The uptake of these is happening at a really amazing pace, and I think we're going to see more and more demand from residents to be able to add solar. I mean, one of the things that's frustrating for folks in the Detroit Edison service area right now is that the utility controls how many customers they allow to install solar on their roof and to connect it to the grid, and it's capped at a certain amount. And so, you're going to likely need some legislative changes to allow more of this distributed solar where people can have these like plug-in type units. And there's some really cool stuff you can do. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the way that it's structured in Germany feeds into the grid. If the grid goes down, they're all shut off to, again, avoid electric shocks and that kind of thing for utility workers that are out looking to restore power. And that's very important. But you can also do things like charge batteries with them that then you have available to use if you do lose power. And, it's also pretty exciting. This is separate from our conversation here in Detroit, but, in the developing world, these types of technologies are amazing because people can, with one solar panel, they can charge up a smartphone. They can, in some cases, operate, fans and like basic air conditioning units. And so it's really cool. And then again, you're not burning fossil fuels to do all that. So, and you don't have to have all the investments that go into taking a grid, connecting power lines to a rural community in the developing world. So anyway, there's some really exciting things about this technology for us here in Southeast Michigan. And the idea is that, okay, more solar on roofs, more solar on balconies, more solar on people's porches. That's going to help generate electricity, which can decrease utility bills potentially for those people that are deploying the solar, and also alleviate the need for things like more natural gas being burned to generate electricity. And so with data centers coming online and needing more power, I think if we can get more solar deployed on roofs, deployed on the top of warehouses all over the place, that will help with this demand, and that can avoid us having to, again, continue to burn fossil fuels or to spend a lot of money building like a new nuclear generator, which are, tens of billions of dollars to generate those kind of large scale industrial nuclear facilities. So in any case, I think it's very exciting. There will need to be some regulation here in Michigan that will govern our use, like you mentioned, in other states, Utah and Maine. We can do that. And again, I think that's something that is very exciting. And the utilities they're going to resist. They're going to push back because, again, they make a lot of their money by building electric generating capacity, and there are challenges to tying in a whole bunch of different solar panels into the grid. And so the utility wants to control that. They want to control the potential revenue from that. And so that's where it's going to take some significant involvement with our legislature. And the way to make that happen is through the public demanding that our legislature do it.
Nick Schreck is Dean of the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. Nick, thanks as always for coming on to the Metro.
Thanks, Robin.
And we should note, DTE Energy advertises here on WDET. Coming up, there are now only 2 Democrats left in Michigan's Senate race. We'll discuss what that means. Stay with us.